I wanted to ask you a little bit, who here has read Forbes magazine or looked at Forbes.com? Excellent. Anyone tell me what Forbes is known for?
The
list.
The list. Well, like the richest list. You guys
right.
compile that. Carlos Slim is now.
Yep, the richest man in the world. But also Forbes is more broadly known for finance and business and capitalism. And we like to think of ourselves as the capitalist tool. We've had that on balloons and little bags that we give out when people come visit and so on. And I just wanted to say to you this evening, as I make these comments, I am a firm believer in our free market system, but we also like to think of ourselves as something of drama critics of business. And obviously, there's a lot to be criticizing these days about business, and certainly about Wall Street. And I wanted to talk to you a little bit about, first of all, from an almost academic point of view. When you look at fraud, very often people think of fraud and white-collar crime and people going to jail as something of an exception. It's something that happens to that other group, that group that's different from me. But when you look at actually the statistics, and these statistics are from something called the Association of Certified Fraud Examiners, they estimate that in the United States there is close to $1 trillion worth of white-collar fraud in the United States every year. To put that in perspective, that's roughly what the United States spent on 6 years in the Iraq War. How can it be that much? Where do you think is a big area of white-collar fraud in this country?
Finance.
Finance would be a good one, although some of that is legal stealing, and I'm not sure that that would get you into the fraud.
Insurance.
Insurance is big.
Retail.
I would think retail, because a lot of things fall off the back of trucks. That would probably be a big one.
The Medicare and Medicaid.
There you go. That's huge. Roughly 15% of the U.S. economy, a $14 trillion economy, is medicine. By many estimates, about 10% of that is fraudulent. So you round those numbers, you get about $200 billion a year just in medical-related fraud. Excuse me? Should have been a doctor. My daughter just got braces. Talk about legal extortion. But in any case, it's a big problem. It's a big cost to the United States. It's a big cost worldwide. And of course, in some countries, it's probably even worse than it is in the United States. And to give you a sense of the sweep, I was looking at the newspapers over the last several days. And it's easy. You can look every day and you can see some things, some examples I've seen. Big banks move to mask risk levels. I'm sure the group in here is familiar with that one. And this is right after we've had a scandal. You see the same thing going on with the window dressing at the end of the quarters. Minnesota Ponzi scheme operator gets 50-year term. New York lawyers charged in $10 million mortgage fraud scheme. Dallas City Hall corruption defendant sentenced to 24 months. And here's my favorite. Second LA man sentenced in tomato corruption probe. How do you have corrupt tomatoes? I'm not sure. This was actually related to Safeway, and he worked as a buyer, and he was taking money under the table to buy tomatoes from a certain source. When you talk about fraud, and if this guy up here is telling you that fraud is everywhere, that it's so common, so ubiquitous, then how can that be? Is that part of human nature? Well, people who study fraud, and fraud examiners, forensic accountants, talk often about the fraud triangle. Have you guys looked at the fraud triangle at all? The fraud triangle is supposed to sort of describe the psychology of fraud. To give you an extreme example, if you were walking down this hallway here and you bumped into somebody, do you think that if they knocked into you, you would be tempted to, let's say, grab a letter opener and stab them in the heart? That would probably strike you as a fairly extreme example. But what about if you were, let's say, you had a test and you were driving to school and you got up late and you had to come down the highway. The speed limit was 60. And you said to yourself, looking at the fraud triangle, well, your rationalization is, you know what? Everybody speeds. I see people speeding all the time. There's nothing wrong with speeding. I'm not going to hurt anybody. I'm not going to kill anybody. Opportunity? I don't see any cops anywhere. The incentive? I got my final exam and I got to be there on time because this professor is a you-know-what. So it works on many levels throughout our lives, and I don't think when you look at the fraud triangle you should assume that it's other people. It's part of the way we think. Certainly it happens when people plagiarize. And when people plagiarize, what are they going to think? Well, the rationalization might be, there's a lot of plagiarism going on, everyone's doing it. The opportunity, I don't think my professor will find out. And the incentive, of course, is it's easier to cut and paste than it is to write. So you see this all the time. One interesting thing as a reporter that I see all the time is that when you talk about the fraud triangle, but you're talking about it now, not in terms of speeding a little bit to get somewhere quickly, but in terms of real life fraud. And I look at it in terms of the business cases and the business examples that I've seen a lot. Very often I get the same, I will be doing a story, I'll be investigating about a company or a government official doing something that I think is ethically or legally questionable, and I will ask them, I'll confront them at some point and ask them about their behavior. And so often the answer is, it's everybody's doing it. It's industry practice, as if doing something wrong because everyone is doing something wrong would justify it. And I can give you a couple of examples. About 2 years ago, I did a story on the treasurer of North Carolina, a gentleman named Richard Moore. And he was the sole fiduciary, the one person who was in charge of a $70 billion pension fund. This is how it works in North Carolina. This is how it works in New York. $70 billion, and I started looking at his portfolio and where he was giving out money. Well, it turned out one of the things he decided to do when he became treasurer was to give more money to alternative investments, to hedge funds and private equity funds. So I started looking at where he was giving the money, and there was this odd coincidence that he was giving money to manage to companies that were giving money to the Richard Moore for Governor campaign. So in other words, there was a quid pro quo going on here. The treasurer who wants to be governor hands out money, very lucrative money management assignments, and in exchange he is receiving campaign contributions. So when I asked Richard Moore, what's going on with this, what do you think his response was? Everyone's doing it, it's industry practice, this is how it's done, and to be more specific, he said to me, it's disclosed, as if that makes it okay. How is it that a company like MCI WorldCom can get away with these things? And I would say you can blame the fraudsters, you can blame the people who are perpetrating these crimes, this wrongdoing, but I would also say that it's interesting how all of our collective market psychology feeds into this. Interestingly, there's a magazine called CFO Magazine. And in these 3 years, which was the peak of the technology boom, they named 3 chief financial officers of the year. Now, this isn't a guy from Forbes picking on another magazine. Interestingly, the people who chose the CFO of the year was not the editors of the magazine or the readers, it was their fellow CFOs. These were people from Pepsi, from IBM, from General Electric. These were their peers who were asked to vote on who's the best CFO of the year. And they picked these 3 gentlemen to be their CFOs of the year. Which gets me to the question of what could solve some of our problems. And I'm not an expert on this, although I've done some thinking about it, and I don't think there is a silver bullet. I don't think fraud is something you can just solve with the wave of a signing in Washington, D.C. or anything else. But I do think that these things, training, consequences, tone, and pay, are important.